the rusted bolts of the shop sign sheared off with a sound like a dry bone snapping. Marina dove onto the salt-stained pavement just as 40 pounds of weathered oak slammed into the porch, missing her skull by inches. As she lay there, heart hammering against the grit, the mechanical thwack-thwack of a camera shutter cut through the ringing in her ears. A black SUV with windows like ink sat idling at the curb, its lens fixed on her wreckage. Before she could scream for an explanation, the vehicle lunged forward, leaving her choking in a cloud of exhaust and a terrifying realization. Someone wasn't just waiting for her to fail. They were documenting every crack in her foundation. Inside the shop, the silence was even more dangerous. While cleaning up the spilled contents of her best friend's bag, Marina's fingers brushed against a heavy, matte folder that didn't belong in a small-town boutique. She pulled out a map of the coastline, but the familiar curves of the harbor were buried under aggressive, blood-red zones. A single, jagged circle sat directly over the coordinates of her shop, labeled with a corporate logo she had only seen in headlines about coastal sharks and demolished legacies. The sound of Jenna's footsteps approached from the back room, hurried and heavy. But the woman approaching didn't sound like the friend Marina had known for 20 years. Marina shoved the map back, her skin crawling with the cold electricity of a trap snapping shut. Marina Holloway pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the front door. The gold leaf lettering of "The Knot and Hook" had begun to flake, tiny cracks spidering through the once bold serif. Outside, a salt-heavy wind whipped across the Cape Cod pavement, chasing hollow soda cans and scraps of yesterday's newspaper down the desolate street. The town felt like a photograph left too long in the sun, colors bleeding out into a monochromatic gray of neglect. Marina inhaled deeply, catching the sharp scent of rotting kelp and damp earth, a smell that had shifted from a familiar comfort to the bitter aroma of collapsing dreams. Her fingers tightened around the brass door handle, tracing every chip in the weathered metal. A knot of bile rose in her throat. The silence of the empty sidewalk pressed against her eardrums, a physical weight confirming that the tourists and regulars alike had vanished into the jaws of the looming economic winter. She turned away from the door and began a slow, rhythmic circuit of the shop. Her boots echoed with a hollow thud against the bare floorboards, a sound far too loud for a place that should have been bustling. The shelves, once overflowing with vibrant skeins of hand-dyed wool and intricate wicker baskets, now gaped like open wounds. Dust bunnies congregated in the corners, gray and soft as ghosts. From somewhere above, a methodical, irritating sound broke the stillness. Drip, drip, drip. Marina tilted her head back. Around a dark, spreading bruise on the ceiling, the plaster had begun to blister and sag. A fat droplet broke free, plummeting into a plastic bucket already half full of murky water. She reached out to touch the heavy metal register, her finger clicking the empty drawer open. Inside, a single nickel and 2 pennies lay lonely against the black plastic. The cold from the concrete foundation seeped through her soles, a chill that climbed her spine and made her shoulders hunch. The sudden, piercing trill of the landline phone shattered the silence, the sound ricocheting off the naked walls. Marina froze, her gaze fixed on the blinking red light of the caller ID. New England Threads. This marked their 5th attempt since sunrise. Before the echo of the ringer could even fade, the mobile phone in her pocket began to vibrate against her thigh, a frantic, buzzing pulse. She pulled the device out to find a text message from her hardware supplier, written in all caps, demanding payment for the brass fittings by the end of the week. Her thumb hovered over the glowing screen, trembling slightly, but she couldn't bring herself to tap reply. The vibration started again, filling the room with the sensation of an invisible noose tightening around her neck, strand by agonizing strand. A pair of warm, soft hands suddenly covered Marina's icy ones, squeezing gently. Jenna Carter stood there, her eyes dancing with a feverish, almost frantic enthusiasm as she pointed toward the harbor. Out there, the first white skeletons of the festival tents were already rising against the blue Massachusetts sky. Jenna's arms moved in wide, sweeping arcs, painting a picture of the thousands of tourists who would soon descend on the Cape for the Lobster Festival. Their pockets heavy with vacation cash and a desire for local charm. Marina felt Jenna's hands shift to her shoulders, giving her a firm shake to snap her out of the trance. Jenna's voice rose, bright and sharp, cutting through the low howl of the wind, rattling the window panes. As Jenna began mapping out a new floor plan for the remaining stock, Marina felt her own spine straighten. She allowed that surge of confidence, that relentless optimism her best friend always radiated, to wash over her like a warm tide. Moments later, Marina stood balanced on the top rung of a skeletal wooden ladder. She used her elbow to pin a heavy garland of artificial seaweed and decorative cork floats against the cedar shingles. Her fingers, grimy with dust and old paint, fumbled with a length of twine as she tried to thread it through a rusted iron hook above the entrance. The wind was a fickle thing, pushing at her back 1 second and then jerking the edge of the shop's sign the next, making the ladder beneath her feet groan in protest. She clamped a handful of galvanized nails between her teeth, the metallic tang sharp on her tongue, and reached higher toward the eaves. The sun caught the shop windows, throwing a blinding glare into her eyes, but she ignored the sting. She smoothed out the blue decorative ribbons, determined to give the crumbling facade of the knot and hook a festive mask, even as beads of sweat traced paths through the dust on her temples. A sudden, violent screech of metal on metal made Marina's head snap up. The massive wooden sign, the one her father had hung 40 years ago, groaned as it tilted forward. She watched in slow motion as the rusted bolts sheared off, popping out of the rotten header with a sound like dry bone snapping. The heavy sign plummeted. A cloud of orange rust and splintered wood exploded into the air, stinging Marina's face. Instinct took over. She kicked away from the ladder, her boots scrambling for purchase as she tumbled backward. The sign slammed into the porch boards just inches from her toes, the impact jarring the entire building. It split down the middle with a sickening crack. Marina's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her ears ringing from the crash. She stared at the wreckage, the jagged wood a reminder of how narrowly she had escaped being crushed. Marina wiped her grimy palms against her denim thighs, her breath still coming in ragged gasps, when a flash of unnatural light caught her eye from across the street. A black SUV, polished to a mirror finish with windows so dark they looked like ink, sat idling at the curb. It looked like a predatory shark among the battered pickups of the local fishermen. Marina squinted, watching as a narrow slit appeared at the top of the driver's side window. A professional camera lens emerged, its glass eye fixed squarely on the broken face of the shop. Marina stood paralyzed as a cold shiver traced her spine. The lens panned slowly, documenting the jagged cracks in the foundation and the splintered remains of the sign on the porch. She took a tentative step forward, trying to see the face behind the glass. But she found only her own distorted, dusty reflection staring back from the tint. Anger flared, hot and sudden, overriding the fear. Marina marched toward the SUV, her arm extended in a sharp, stop gesture. The stranger inside didn't flinch. Instead, he squeezed off several more frames, the mechanical thwack-thwack of the shutter audible even over the wind. Just as she reached the edge of the pavement, only feet from the vehicle's hood, the engine erupted in a powerful, guttural roar. Marina opened her mouth to shout a question, but the driver jerked the wheel. The SUV lunged forward, tires screaming as they fought for traction on the gravel. She was left standing in a choking cloud of exhaust and flying grit, her lungs burning. As the vehicle sped away, she noticed it lacked even a temporary plate. Her knees began to tremble, a delayed reaction to a threat she couldn't quite name. She turned back to the shop and saw Jenna's leather bag lying on the floor, spilled during the chaos of the sign's fall. As Marina knelt to gather the scattered keys and lipsticks, her hand brushed against something stiff, tucked deep between the lining and the leather. She pulled it out, a thick folder made of heavy, matte cardstock. Embossed on the cover was a sleek logo, a stylized steel bridge arching over the words Atlantic Reach. Marina's fingers tightened on the edge of the document, the expensive paper feeling strangely heavy. The cadastral map slid halfway out, its edges crisp and white, but the surface was marred by aggressive red zones drawn over the familiar curves of the Cape Cod coastline. She froze, the map a silent witness to a plan she wasn't meant to see. From the back of the shop, the sound of Jenna's approaching footsteps echoed on the wood. Marina stared at the name Atlantic Reach, and the ghost of a headline from last year's Boston Globe flickered in her mind. These were the Sharks of the Coast, a corporate entity known for turning historic fishing piers into glass and steel monstrosities. She remembered images of demolished lighthouses and the hollow eyes of shop owners whose legacies had been bulldozed for yacht clubs. Her fingertips began to tingle with a cold, electric realization. A company like this didn't take scouting photos for fun. She looked back at the map and saw that one of the largest red circles sat directly over the coordinates of her own shop. A hollow, icy void opened in her stomach. The scale of the map suggested something far larger than a simple buyout. It looked like a tactical invasion. Her breathing became heavy, each lungful of air feeling like lead. The door to the back room swung open, and Jenna stepped through, her smile vanishing the moment she saw the folder in Marina's hands. Jenna's face drained of color, leaving her skin looking like parchment, and fine beads of sweat broke out along her hairline. Without a word, Jenna lunged forward, her movements jagged and desperate. She snatched the documents from Marina's grip, shoving them back into her bag with a frantic haste that bordered on violence. Marina watched as her friend's eyes darted everywhere but her face. Jenna began a stuttering, nonsensical explanation about old blueprints and a new client in the city, her hands shaking as she struggled with the bag's zipper. The air between them suddenly felt thick and sour, tainted by the scent of Jenna's expensive perfume and the chemical smell of corporate ink. Marina retreated into the shadows of the doorway, watching through the glass as Jenna practically ran to her car. The engine turned over with a frantic whine, and Jenna backed out so fast the tires chirped. Marina reached into her apron pocket, her fingers finding the heavy, cold keys to her old delivery van. As soon as Jenna's taillights disappeared around the harbor bend, Marina jumped into the driver's seat. She turned the key, keeping the lights off as the van rumbled to life. She trailed 2 blocks behind, using the deepening coastal twilight as a shroud. Her gaze remained locked on the twin red embers of Jenna's car, which were leading her away from the commercial district and toward the rusted, skeletal remains of the old canning warehouses by the deep water port. Marina gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, the fear in her chest hardening into a cold, sharp resolve. The next morning, the tension inside the knot and hook was a physical weight. Jenna stood at the main counter, a black marker in her hand. She grabbed the printed inventory plan Marina had spent all night agonizing over and, with a single, aggressive stroke, drew a thick black line through the top half. The sound of the felt tip dragging across the paper was like a serrated blade on bone. Marina watched, speechless, as Italian wool and hand-forged copper needles disappeared under a shroud of ink. Jenna tossed the paper aside, and it drifted lazily to the floor, settling in a patch of dust. Jenna's voice was a flat, clinical drone as she argued that spending their last reserves on luxury yarn before a tourist influx was a fool's errand. She grabbed the new supply catalog and crumpled it into a ball, pitching it into the trash with a finality that made Marina's throat tighten. An hour later, Marina sat in the small back office, the blue glow of the laptop screen carving deep, exhausted hollows into her face. Her fingers shook as she typed the password for the shop's business account. When the page finally loaded, the expected balance was gone, replaced by a massive crimson banner. Account frozen. She clicked the notification bell, but the cursor merely spun in a mocking, endless loop. A dry, legalistic pop-up informed her that all assets associated with the knot and hook were restricted pending a compliance review. Marina's palms turned slick with sweat. The hum of the computer's cooling fan seemed to grow to a roar in the sudden silence of the office. Her pulse throbbed in her temples, a frantic drumbeat that matched the flickering of the cursor on the screen. She began a desperate search through the digital archives of their recent filings. Her breath hitched when she found a PDF titled Supplementary Agreement Number Frovers. She zoomed in, her heart stopping. There, at the bottom of the page next to the shop's official seal, was a bold, looping signature. She recognized the specific flourish on the J, the same one Jenna used on every birthday card they'd ever exchanged. The fine print of the document outlined a total delegation of signing authority in the event of technical restructuring. A wave of nausea rolled over her. The legal jargon on the screen blurred into a swarm of black insects. This wasn't a mistake or a clerical error. Jenna had spent months weaving a legal web, and now, with a single keystroke, she had pulled the silk tight around Marina's throat. The sound of heavy tires on gravel drew Marina to the front window. A white van with the Atlantic Reach logo on the door pulled onto her small parking lot. The doors slammed with a coordinated, metallic bang. 3 men in neon yellow vests climbed out, hauling laser levels and bundles of sharpened steel stakes. One of the men, his face a mask of indifference, marched to the center of Marina's flower bed. He drove a metal spike directly through the heart of a blooming hydrangea she had planted in memory of her father. A heavy sledgehammer rose and fell, filling the air with a rhythmic, clanging violence. Marina watched as the delicate blue petals were ground into the mud under the men's heavy work boots. They began unspooling a reel of neon yellow tape, cordoning off her porch from the street as if it were a crime scene. Marina burst through the front door, nearly tripping over a newly driven stake. She grabbed the sleeve of the loud worker, a burly man with a thick neck, trying to shout over the roar of a nearby generator. The man didn't even turn his head. He gave a sharp, practiced shove with his elbow, sending Marina reeling back toward the door. The impact of his heavy canvas sleeve against her chest knocked the wind out of her. He spat a glob of tobacco juice onto her porch and tapped a ruggedized tablet. On the screen, a digital map showed the knot and hook, highlighted in a cold, clinical gray, the universal color for demolition. He grunted that the land was now under corporate jurisdiction and that her presence was a liability. Marina leaned against the cold cedar shingles of her shop, feeling like a ghost haunting her own property. From behind the bulk of the corporate van, Jenna emerged. She was wearing a tailored cashmere coat, a garment that cost more than Marina's entire monthly inventory. Jenna didn't look away this time. Her gaze was a polished, unbreakable shield. She reached into a designer handbag and pulled out a slim ivory envelope, turning it over in her gloved hands. Her voice was steady, devoid of the warmth that had defined their 20-year friendship. She admitted that her signature on the coastal assessment acts had been the final key Atlantic Reach needed to unlock the harbor. Marina's eyes dropped to Jenna's wrist, where a new gold watch glinted in the sun, a trophy of the betrayal. Behind her, the rhythmic clack-clack of the sledgehammer continued, each blow a nail in the coffin of Marina's life. Jenna took a step closer, her face twisting into a mask of sharp irritation. She began to shout, her voice rising over the wind. She called Marina a hoarder of rot, accusing her of dragging them both into a grave by clinging to a pile of termite-eaten wood. Jenna gestured wildly at the peeling paint and the empty windows, calling Marina's loyalty cowardice disguised as tradition. According to Jenna, the Cape was a dying dog, and Atlantic Reach was the only vet in town. Marina watched a fleck of white foam form at the corner of Jenna's mouth. The words felt like stones. Jenna claimed that if Marina wanted to rot in poverty, she could do it alone. But Jenna had chosen a future that was already bought and paid for in corporate stock. Marina retreated into the shop, her breath coming in shallow hitches. She grabbed the telephone receiver, her fingers fumbling as she dialed Mr. Greenberg, the man who had supplied her wool for a decade. The moment she identified herself, a dry, hacking cough erupted from the other end of the line. Greenberg's usual warmth was gone, replaced by a voice as hard as flint. He told her flatly that he wouldn't ship another yard on credit. Marina heard the rustle of ledgers as he demanded an immediate wire transfer for her outstanding balance. She tried to plead, to mention the festival, but the line went dead with a final, mechanical click. The dial tone hummed in her ear, a flat line for her business. Outside, a battered municipal sedan screeched to a halt at the curb. A building inspector in a rumpled uniform climbed out, carrying a roll of heavy-duty adhesive tape and a large, neon-orange placard. Marina watched through the glass as he smoothed the sign directly over the gold lettering of her shop door. In bold, black ink, it read, "Unsafe for occupancy. Condemned." The inspector pressed the tape down with a forceful thumb, effectively sealing the entrance. He stepped back, pulled out a digital camera, and snapped a photo of the sealed door. Each click of the shutter felt like the sound of a hammer hitting a coffin nail, finalizing the destruction of everything she had built from her father's legacy. Marina threw the door open, the orange tape snapping with a sharp pop. She demanded to know who had authorized this. The inspector didn't look up from his clipboard. He simply adjusted his glasses and read from a typed report. He informed her that an anonymous tip had triggered a priority inspection, complete with a detailed photo file of the foundation cracks and the fallen sign. Marina's heart sank as she realized the angles of the photos in his file matched the ones taken by the man in the black SUV. The inspector stated the building was an imminent public hazard. The ground felt like it was liquefying beneath her. The trap had been set weeks ago, and she had walked right into the center of it. Jenna turned her back on Marina then, treating her like a piece of the condemned scenery. The black SUV from the previous day glided to the curb, its engine a low, predatory hum. The rear door swung open, revealing a man in a sharp gray suit sitting in the climate-controlled shadows. Jenna stepped into the car with the grace of someone who had practiced the move a dozen times. She didn't look back as the heavy door shut with a muffled, expensive thud. The vehicle pulled away slowly, leaving nothing behind but the scent of expensive leather and a swirl of dust. Marina stood on her porch, framed by the tattered orange tape, watching the red tail lights vanish. She was alone in the wreckage. Her legs finally gave out. Marina sank onto the cold, pitted concrete of the porch steps. Her fingers curled around the edge of the condemnation notice, the thick paper tearing under her nails. She looked at her hands, stained with dust, old paint, and the salt of the Atlantic. and felt a single, hot tear carve a path through the grime on her cheek. The wind off the ocean turned vicious, tugging at her hair and stinging her eyes with sand. The only sounds left were the distant, rhythmic crash of the surf and the lonely creak of a single sign hinge. She realized then that Jenna hadn't just sold the land. She had sold the very memory of their friendship, and she had done it for a seat in a car that didn't have room for anyone else. The day of the Lobster Festival arrived like a fever dream. Marina fought her way through the dense, sweltering crowd on the main square. The air was a thick soup of frying oil, salt, and the brassy blare of a marching band. Her eyes were locked on a towering wall of corrugated steel that shouldn't have been there. Where the white cedar shingles of the Knot and Hook once caught the morning light, there was now only a gray, windowless barrier stamped with the blue Atlantic Reach logo. The sun reflected off the metal, a searing glare that forced her to squint. She ran her hand along the vibrating steel, feeling the deep, mechanical throb of heavy machinery working somewhere behind the wall. Her shop, her father's shop, was gone, swallowed whole by a corporate shroud. A man pushed through the crowd toward her. Mr. Collins, a local lawyer whose suit always looked like it had been slept in. He didn't say a word, just handed her a heavy accordion folder secured with a thick rubber band. Marina's fingers fumbled with a yellowed contract, the one Jenna had pressured her to sign during a late-night inventory session months ago. Collins used a chewed pencil to point to a tiny, dense paragraph in Addendum B. Marina squinted at the text. Voluntary waiver of historic preservation easements. Her own signature sat at the bottom of the page, a bold stroke of ink from a night when Jenna had brought over a bottle of wine and promised the document was just a tax formality. The paper felt like a live coal in her hand. She looked up at Collins, who simply adjusted his glasses and looked at his shoes. Without the historic status, the Knot and Hook was no longer a landmark. It was just a pile of depreciated lumber. Marina looked past him to where a massive crane arm swung over the top of the steel fence, a concrete crushing ball dangling from its cable like a pendulum. A low, constant roar filled her ears. She realized that no injunction or town meeting could save the building now. The legal armor had been stripped away, leaving the shop a naked target for the excavators idling behind the fence. The very ground seemed to vibrate with the hunger of the diesel engines. On the main stage, draped in bunting and plastic lobsters, a flurry of camera flashes erupted. Marina saw Jenna. Her friend wore a silk dress the color of the deep Atlantic, her hair perfectly coiffed against the coastal breeze. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the mayor, whose bleached smile was plastered on every progress poster in town. Beside them stood the man from the SUV, holding a velvet cushion with a pair of oversized gold scissors. Jenna gripped the handles, the blades meeting with a sharp, synchronized snip as she severed the ceremonial red ribbon. The crowd roared in approval, and on the massive LED screen behind them, a 3D rendering of a glass hotel bloomed like a digital weed on the exact spot where Marina's porch had once stood. Marina lunged for the stage, her shoulders knocking aside tourists who grumbled over their lobster rolls. She screamed Jenna's name, but the sound was swallowed by the rhythmic thump of a bass drum. Two men in dark suits and mirrored shades stepped into her path, their bodies forming an unbreakable wall of muscle. One of them placed a heavy, leather-gloved palm against her chest, physically steering her away from the lights and toward a narrow gap between the equipment trailers. Marina tried to twist away, but she was caught in a crush of sweating bodies and canvas walls. The smell of diesel and cheap carnival perfume became overwhelming as the security team methodically herded her into the shadows behind the stage. The representative from Atlantic Reach appeared from the side of a trailer, his gray suit looking untouched by the humidity. He moved with a predatory grace, pinning Marina against the corrugated side of a storage unit. Out here, the festive music was a distorted vibration that made her molars ache. He adjusted his silk tie, his face as blank and cold as a tombstone. He stepped into her personal space, and she caught the scent of an expensive, woody cologne. Marina's shoulder blades pressed into the hot metal of the trailer. She looked around, but the security guards had formed a perimeter, ensuring that her struggle remained an invisible footnote to the celebration happening 20 feet away. He reached into a slim leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents held together by a heavy steel clip. He laid them on the lid of a nearby trash bin as if it were a mahogany desk. He tapped a finger against the top page. Notice of intent to file. Fraudulent bankruptcy. His voice was a flat, rehearsed monotone. He informed her that in exactly 58 minutes, these papers would be filed with the county clerk, triggering a total seizure of her personal assets and a criminal investigation into her mismanagement of the shop's accounts. He held out a gold-nibbed fountain pen, the tip gleaming like a needle. He told her she could sign the voluntary transfer of deed now, or spend the next decade in a courtroom she couldn't afford. Jenna stepped out from behind the trailer, her arms crossed tightly over her silk dress. She looked down at Marina with a chilling, clinical detachment. She said the time for sentimental theatrics was over. Jenna pulled a printed bank draft from her clutch, a check for an amount that would clear every one of Marina's debts and leave her with enough to move away. But Marina saw the trap. The check was the final payment for her silence. Jenna's voice turned as sharp as a razor, detailing the millions in lawsuits Atlantic Reach would rain down on her if she refused. The friendship was gone, replaced by a cold-blooded ultimatum delivered in the shade of a garbage bin. Jenna tapped a button on her tablet and turned the screen toward Marina. A live feed showed 3 yellow bulldozers lined up at the edge of the harbor, their engines blowing thick plumes of black smoke into the blue sky. The operators sat in their cabs, hands on the levers, waiting for a signal. Marina felt a wave of vertigo. She realized that Jenna didn't need a court order to destroy the shop. She just needed to give the word to the men on the screen. The machines looked like a pack of starved hounds, their metal teeth ready to tear into the cedar and heart pine. The reality of the threat was a physical weight on Marina's chest. Marina struggled to draw air, her throat constricting. Jenna leaned in so close that Marina could see the tiny, frantic pulse in her neck. Jenna began a low-voiced litany of Marina's failures. The unpaid taxes, her father's medical bills, the crumbling roof. She used their shared history as a weapon, twisting every confidence Marina had ever given her into a reason to surrender. Marina felt a crushing pressure in her lungs, as if the entire weight of the Atlantic was pressing down on her. The psychological cage Jenna had built was perfect, leaving no room for a counter-argument, no space to breathe, and no way to scream for help over the roar of the festival. Jenna grabbed Marina's hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and forced the heavy fountain pen into her palm. Marina's fingers were shaking so violently she almost dropped it. Jenna leaned in, her breath warm against Marina's ear, whispering that this was the only way to survive the slaughter. From the square, the crowd began a rhythmic chant. New town, new shore. The sound vibrated through the ground. Jenna tightened her hand over Marina's, physically guiding the pen toward the signature line. Marina saw a shadow of a seagull pass over the white paper, a fleeting image of a world where she wasn't a prisoner. Marina stared at the blank line, the place where her family's history was supposed to end. The corporate man checked his watch, his thumb hovering over a send button on his phone. The second hand ticked forward with a mechanical finality. Marina felt like a cornered animal, the walls closing in. Every second of silence was a heartbeat closer to the filing of the lawsuit. Jenna's eyes were locked on hers, a hypnotic, predatory stare that demanded submission. Marina lowered the pen toward the paper, the black ink swelling into a heavy drop on the nib, poised to fall and erase 40 years of her life with a single, dark blot. Suddenly, Marina's spine snapped straight. A cold, crystalline clarity washed through her, purging the fear. She jerked her hand back, breaking Jenna's grip. With a sudden, violent motion, she hurled the gold pen across the alley. It struck a pile of construction debris with a sharp clink and vanished into the gray dust. Marina drew a massive, shuddering breath of salt air, her lungs finally expanding to their full capacity. The suffocating weight in her chest evaporated, replaced by a searing, white-hot defiance. She looked at Jenna, and for the first time in months, she didn't see a friend or a monster. She saw a frightened woman who had sold her soul for a cashmere coat. Marina grabbed the stack of documents from the trash bin and bolted. She tore through the backstage area, ignoring the shouts of the suit-clad guards. She scrambled up the wooden stairs of the main stage, bursting into the light just as the mayor was beginning a joke about lobster bibs. The microphone screeched as she grabbed the stand, a sound that pierced the festive atmosphere like a siren. The crowd of hundreds fell into an uneasy silence, their upturned faces a sea of confusion. Marina leaned into the mic, her breath ragged and amplified, her gaze sweeping over the townspeople who had known her father, the people who were about to lose their harbor to a lie. She held the Atlantic Reach contract high above her head. With a guttural cry, she hooked her thumbs into the top of the stack and ripped. The sound of tearing cardstock was like a gunshot. She shredded the papers with a frantic, rhythmic energy, her fingers working until the legal threats and the voluntary transfer were nothing but a handful of white confetti. She threw the scraps into the air, watching as the wind caught them, swirling the corporate promises over the heads of the stunned officials. The fragments settled on the mayor's shoulders and the representative's polished shoes. Marina felt a wild, soaring triumph as she watched her bankruptcy flutter away into the harbor. Her voice erupted from the speakers, a deep, resonant boom that silenced the last of the brass band. She didn't use a script. She used the truth. She detailed the forged signatures, the secret maps, and the plan to turn the public library into a private lounge. She pointed a trembling finger at Jenna, whose horrified face was now projected 50 feet high on the LED screen behind the stage. Marina told the crowd about the red zones, the tactical plan to erase the town's soul for the sake of a quarterly report. The tourists stopped eating. The locals began to murmur, a low tectonic shift of energy. She asked them if they were ready to be ghosts in their own homes. The corporate representative lunged for her, his face a mask of panicked aggression. He reached for her arm, intent on dragging her away from the microphone. But a massive, calloused hand intercepted him. Mr. Greenberg, the wool supplier, stepped onto the stage, his heavy work boots thundering on the wood. He didn't say a word. He just stood in front of Marina, his broad shoulders a wall of flannel and defiance. 4 other local fishermen followed him, their faces weathered by decades of salt and sun. They formed a phalanx around Marina, their silence more powerful than any corporate threat. The man in the gray suit recoiled, his polished shoes slipping on the scattered scraps of his own contract. Jenna scrambled onto the stage, her silk dress torn at the hem. She leaned in, her voice a poisonous hiss that only Marina could hear. She spat that Marina had just signed her own death warrant, that the lawsuits would start at dawn and leave her with nothing but the clothes on her back. Marina turned to her, her expression one of quiet, devastating pity. She told Jenna that she had already lost everything that mattered the moment she opened that folder, and that a debt was a small price to pay for the right to look in the mirror. Jenna recoiled as if she'd been struck, the realization dawning that her threats no longer had any teeth. In the chaos, Marina reached into Jenna's discarded clutch and pulled out the leather folder she'd seen that morning. She flipped it open and pressed the secret 3D site plans against the lens of the main television camera. On the giant screen, the town saw the truth. The public park was actually a gated helipad, and the community center was a luxury spa with restricted access. Marina traced the red lines, showing the planned demolition of the historic wharf. The murmurs in the crowd turned into a roar of betrayal. People began to tear up their Atlantic Reach promotional fans. The secret blueprints, smelling of expensive ink, were now the town's rallying cry. The mayor, sensing the sudden change in the political wind, stepped to the microphone, his face pale and sweating. He held up his hands, his voice cracking as he addressed the angry crowd. Under the relentless glare of the news cameras, he announced an immediate moratorium on all Atlantic Reach projects, pending a full criminal investigation into their transparency. Marina watched as the corporate representative snapped his briefcase shut and fled the stage, his power evaporating in the heat of public scrutiny. A wave of cheers broke over the square, a sound so loud it seemed to rattle the masts of the boats in the harbor. Marina leaned against the podium, her strength finally wavering. Jenna backed away, her heels catching on the debris of her failed deal. The crowd's cheers turned into a chorus of boos and whistles as she moved toward the stairs. She pulled her cashmere scarf over her face, trying to hide from the very people she had grown up with. The black SUV was waiting at the curb, its engine idling with a low, desperate growl. She scrambled into the back seat, the door slamming with a final, hollow thud. As the vehicle sped away, Marina saw Jenna's silhouette through the tinted glass, huddled against the leather, clutching a check that was now as worthless as the promises she had made. As the purple shadows of twilight stretched across the town, Marina walked back to the Knot and Hook. She stopped at the edge of the parking lot. The orange condemnation tape had been torn down, left to flutter in the dirt like a shed skin. On the porch, 2 local carpenters were already at work. They were using heavy-duty drills to reattach the father's sign, the wood having been carefully glued and braced. She heard the sharp whine of the drill and saw the splintered K in knot being pulled tight against the header. A neighbor approached her, silently handing her a bucket of soapy water and a scrub brush. Marina touched the glass of the door, where someone had already started to scrape away the grime of the last few months. She turned the key in the lock. The door swung open with a smooth, silent glide. Someone had oiled the hinges while she was at the square. She flipped the light switch, and the warm, amber glow of the shop lamps filled the room, chasing the shadows from the empty shelves. In the center of the floor stood Mr. Greenberg. He held 2 massive wicker baskets overflowing with thick, cream-colored hanks of raw sheep's wool. The rich, earthy scent of lanolin filled the air, a living smell that erased the memory of damp rot. He told her it was an investment, one she didn't have to pay back until she'd sold her first sweater. Marina buried her hands in the soft, springy wool, feeling its warmth. The first rays of the morning sun were just beginning to turn the Atlantic into a sheet of hammered gold when Marina opened both front doors wide. She stepped onto the porch, her bare feet feeling the smooth, swept texture of the heart pine boards. The air was crisp, smelling of salt, wet sand, and the promise of a clean slate. On the horizon, a lone fishing boat let out a long, low whistle, a greeting to the new day. The front window of the Knot and Hook was clear and bright, and the sign above her head was held fast by new steel bolts. Marina took a long, deep breath, her shoulders square against the wind, knowing that while the debt remained, the soul of the shop was finally, irrevocably hers.